Let me tell you something about the human ego. It's a quiet force, hidden just beneath the surface of every choice we make, every word we speak, every silence we hold. We like to believe we are rational beings, guided by reason and free will. But in truth, so much of what we do is a negotiation between the fragile voice of our inner self and the world's reflection of who we think we are. That negotiation has a name. It is the ego. And here's the strange thing. The ego is both the mask we wear and the mirror we stare into. It's the story we tell ourselves about who we are, but also the prison that keeps us from seeing who we might become. Psychologists have studied this for decades. Sigmund Freud was the one who popularized the term ego, describing it as the mediator between our primitive desires and our higher ideals. But even before Freud, ancient philosophers were wrestling with the same question in different words. Who am I, really? Am I the sum of my desires, my fears, my accomplishments? Or am I something deeper that lives beneath the surface? Now, before we go further, I want you to imagine something. Imagine you walk into a crowded room, and in that instant you feel dozens of invisible threads tugging at you. You stand taller, you adjust your tone, you laugh at things you might not laugh at alone. What's happening there isn't just social behavior, it's your ego performing a role. And the fascinating part is, even if you walked into that room with no script, your ego would still hand you one. It whispers, this is how they should see you. This is how you'll be safe. This is how you'll belong. But here's where it gets even more interesting. If the ego is the actor on stage, who is watching the play? Who is sitting in the audience of your life, quietly judging every move? That is the eternal loop the ego creates. It makes you the star, the critic, and the audience all at once. And when you begin to notice this, really notice it, the way you see yourself starts to shift. Here's something researchers discovered. The ego is not just about arrogance or pride. In fact, most of the time it's about protection. Think of it as a shield. According to studies in social psychology, the ego works as a kind of defense mechanism, preserving our self-esteem when the world threatens to crack it. When someone criticizes us, when we fail, when we feel invisible, the ego steps in. It bends the truth, reshapes the memory, polishes the narrative until it feels bearable again. But here's the paradox. The very thing that protects us is also the thing that can suffocate us. Because when the ego becomes too strong, it stops us from growing. It tells us, you are already right. You are already enough. You don't need to question yourself. And in that moment, the same shield that once kept us safe becomes a cage we build around ourselves. Now let me ask you something. How many times in your life have you argued? Not because you were truly certain, but because the thought of being wrong felt unbearable. How many times have you held onto an identity, a label, a title, even when it no longer fit you, just because the alternative was too frightening? That's ego. And if you think you don't have one, that's just your ego talking in disguise. There's a psychological term for this. It's called cognitive dissonance. It describes the discomfort we feel when our beliefs and our actions don't match. The ego's job is to reduce that discomfort. If you see yourself as honest but tell a lie, the ego whispers, it wasn't really lying. It was protecting someone. If you see yourself as hardworking but procrastinate for days, the ego assures you, you work best under pressure. Do you see what's happening? The ego is not interested in truth. It's interested in survival. But here's the twist. The ego isn't evil. It isn't an enemy we need to destroy. It's simply part of being human. In fact, without it, we would crumble under the weight of the world's judgments. The problem is not that we have an ego, but that we often mistake the ego for who we truly are. Think of it like this. The ego is a mask, but the mask, if worn long enough, begins to mold itself to the face. We start believing that the mask is the face, that the story is the truth, and the longer we cling to that story, the harder it becomes to hear the quiet voice underneath. The voice that asks not, how am I being seen, but who am I really? here's where the curiosity deepens. Modern neuroscience shows us something fascinating. The brain has what's called a default mode network. This network lights up when we're thinking about ourselves, our past, our future, our image in the world. It is, quite literally, the biological footprint of the ego. And the most curious thing, this network goes quiet during states of deep meditation, or moments of complete flow, when an artist paints, when a musician loses themselves in sound, when you forget yourself in the beauty of the present moment. In those rare moments, the ego loosens its grip, the mask slips, and for a fleeting second, you are simply here, unfiltered, undefended, free. But here's the irony. The ego, even when it quiets, finds its way back. You meditate and then your mind whispers, "Look how calm I am. I must be good at this." That's the ego sneaking in through the back door. It's as if the ego cannot stand being unseen. It thrives on attention, even the attention of trying to let it go. Let me tell you a story. There was once a monk who spent years in silence, determined to overcome his ego. One day, another monk asked him, "Why are you silent?" And he replied, "Because silence makes me more holy." And in that moment, he realized his silence had simply become a louder form of ego. That's the paradox. The ego can attach itself to anything, even humility. So where does this leave us? If the ego is both our shield and our prison, how do we live with it? That is the heart of the question. And this is where I want to open a loop. Because what I discovered in studying psychology and philosophy is that the ego is not something we conquer. It's something we befriend. And the way we befriend it changes everything about how we live. But before I explain that, let's pause here. Think about the last time someone hurt your feelings, even in a small way. Maybe they ignored your message. Maybe they disagreed with you in front of others. Maybe they didn't give you the recognition you thought you deserved. Do you remember how it felt? That tightening in the chest, that voice saying, "Don't they know who I am?" That's the ego in its rawest form. And the fact that we all feel it tells us something important. The ego is universal. It's not a flaw. It's a shared condition of being human. And here's the hidden beauty. If we can learn to see the ego clearly, if we can catch it in the act without shame, it begins to lose its control. Awareness is like sunlight. The moment we shine it on the ego, it begins to dissolve, and beneath it we discover something softer, something more authentic. The self that doesn't need masks to survive. But what does that self look like? And how do we touch it in everyday life? That, I promise you, is where the real transformation lies. And it might just change the way you see yourself forever. The truth is, the ego will never disappear. Anyone who tells you they've destroyed their ego is simply living inside another ego story. But what we can do is change our relationship to it. Instead of letting it drive the car, we can invite it to sit in the passenger seat. Instead of seeing it as the enemy, we can recognize it as the scared child within us, trying always to keep us safe. Think about it. Every time your ego flares up, it's usually because something precious feels threatened. Your worth, your identity, your belonging. The ego is like a guardian that believes the world is harsher than it really is. So it builds walls. But the problem with walls is that while they keep danger out, they also keep life out. Modern psychology tells us something powerful here. In self-determination theory, researchers found that humans thrive when three needs are met: autonomy, competence, and connection. When any of these feel at risk, the ego rises like a wave. If you're criticized at work, it shakes your sense of competence. If someone rejects you, it threatens your connection. If you feel controlled, your autonomy is under fire, and so the ego steps in to defend. But what if, instead of reacting with defense, we paused and asked, what is my ego protecting right now? Which of my needs feels threatened? That small shift, awareness instead of reaction, can open a door to something deeper. Let me give you an example. Imagine you're in a conversation and someone interrupts you. Instantly your chest tightens. You feel dismissed, invisible. The ego wants to snap back to reclaim space. But if you pause, if you breathe, you might notice, my need for respect feels threatened. My ego is trying to defend me, and suddenly you have a choice. You can lash out, or you can speak calmly, firmly, from a place beyond the ego. The situation transforms not because the ego vanished, but because you saw through it. This practice of seeing the ego clearly is not just psychological, it's deeply spiritual. Many wisdom traditions across time have pointed to the same truth. Freedom begins when we realize we are not the voice in our head. We are the awareness behind the voice. The ego shouts, defend yourself, prove yourself, control everything. But the deeper self whispers, you are already enough. And the more we tune into that quieter voice, the more we begin to live from authenticity rather than fear. But here's where the paradox continues. The ego is not only a source of suffering, it is also a source of drive. Some of the greatest works of art, the boldest discoveries, the deepest ambitions, all were fueled by a kind of ego. The painter who longs to be remembered, the scientist who craves recognition, the leader who wants their vision to matter. Strip all of that away, and perhaps none of these creations would exist. So the goal is not to erase the ego, but to integrate it, to let it serve us without enslaving us. Think of the ego as fire. In a fireplace, it warms the home. Uncontained, it burns the house down. The key is not to fear the fire, but to learn how to hold it. Now, here's something I find fascinating. Studies on meditation and mindfulness consistently show that people who practice awareness develop a different relationship with the ego. They don't necessarily become egoless. Instead, they become less identified with the ego's fluctuations. When praised, they don't cling. When criticized, they don't collapse. Their sense of self is anchored in something deeper than approval or rejection. And maybe that is the secret. Learning to anchor yourself not in the story of the ego, but in the ocean of awareness beneath it. But how do we get there in daily life, outside of meditation cushions and philosophy books? The answer might be simpler than we think. It begins with small acts of noticing. Notice the moment you feel the urge to prove yourself. Notice the sting of being overlooked. Notice the swelling pride when someone admires you. Each of these moments is the ego at work, and each is an invitation to smile at it gently, rather than be consumed by it. There's a metaphor I love. Imagine the ego as a stage actor who refuses to leave the spotlight. Every time you try to push it off stage, it fights harder. But if you simply bow to it, acknowledge it, and let the play go on, the actor begins to relax. In time, it may even step aside, allowing new characters to emerge, like compassion, humility, creativity, and love. And here's the beautiful twist. When the ego loosens, we actually become more connected to others. Why? Because the ego is obsessed with separation. It says, me versus you, my worth against your worth. But when the ego softens, we see ourselves in others. We realize that behind every ego is the same fragile need to be seen, to be valued, to be safe. Suddenly, the people who once threatened us become mirrors of our own humanity, and that recognition changes everything. Imagine a world where, instead of reacting to each other's egos with more ego, we responded with understanding. The angry driver, the boastful colleague, the critical parent, all of them are simply egos trying to protect something tender underneath. If we could see that clearly, how much gentler might we become? But here's the question that lingers. If we are not our ego, then who are we? That is the mystery at the heart of human existence. Some say we are consciousness itself, the silent witness behind the drama. Some say we are love, stripped of all defense. Others say the question cannot be answered in words, only lived. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. The more we learn to see the ego without being swallowed by it, the closer we come to touching that deeper reality. And so here is the paradoxical gift. The ego, though it often blinds us, is also the doorway to awakening. Every flare of pride, every sting of insecurity, every desperate attempt to prove ourselves, each is a signal, a flashing light saying, look here. Something deeper is hiding beneath. If we follow those signals with curiosity instead of judgment, the ego becomes not an enemy, but a teacher. Let me close with this thought. One day you will look back at your life, not at the trophies or the titles, not at the applause or the approval, but at the quiet moments, the way you laughed with a friend, the way you held someone's hand, the way you allowed yourself to be vulnerable and real. In those moments, the ego had no script. It was silent. And yet, those are the moments that will shine the brightest. So perhaps the lesson is not to destroy the ego, but to live gently alongside it, to notice its whispers, to thank it for its protection, but to remind it softly, you are not the master here. You are only a voice in the chorus, and beneath your voice there is music far greater, waiting to be heard. And if you carry nothing else from this, carry this. You are not the story your ego tells. You are the awareness listening to the story. And that awareness, untouched, unbroken, infinite, that is who you truly are.